and the questions at issue with the ICC are separate from that. Diplomacy will continue regardless of the process of the ICC, but I had understood it to be the common position of this House that the international rule of law is an important commitment.
The International Criminal Court was created when 120 countries put their names to the Rome Statute and signed up to the principle that certain basic standards of behaviour must be enforced internationally. And those laws would be applicable to everyone, no matter who they were. From the time when Winston Churchill led the party opposite, this country has been a proud supporter of international law, and it is wrong for us to try to undermine it. Does my honourable friend share my deep disappointment that the Conservatives have fallen as far as they have?
Whatever reservations one may have about the conduct of the conflict in Gaza, there are two fundamental principles. One, Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader of a sovereign state, and two, that state is conducting a legitimate war of self-defence. Now, the Minister acknowledges those facts, but does he not appreciate how this ruling is seen as an affront to those principles by many of my constituents?
And you should explain.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm slightly stumped by the questions opposite. We're signatories to the ICC Act. I think the whole House agrees with the importance of the rule of law. Representations have been made to the ICC in the pre-trial chamber, and they have found they have come to their decisions. I think we should respect their independence.
And in charging Israeli leaders alongside Hamas, the ICC appears to be drawing a moral equivalence between Israel's war of self-defence and Hamas terrorism.
Urgent question. Dame Peter Patel, Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if he'll make a statement on the government's response to the decision taken by the ICC to issue arrest warrants in respect of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, judges of the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and for the reportedly deceased Mohammed Ibrahim al-Masri, commonly known as Daif, Commander-in-Chief of the military wing of Hamas. The ICC is the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious crimes of international concern. It is actively investigating allegations of the gravest crimes in countries around the world, including Ukraine, Sudan, and Libya. In line with this government's stated commitment to the rule of law, we respect the independence of the ICC. We will comply with our international obligations. There is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that determines whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant by the ICC in accordance with the ICC Act of 2001. This process has never been tested because the UK has never been visited by an ICC indictee. If there were to be such a visit to the UK, there would be a court process and due process would be followed in relation to those issues. There is no moral equivalence between Israel, a democracy, and Hamas and Lebanese Hezbollah, two terrorist organisations. This government has been clear. Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with international law. That right is not under question, Mr. Speaker, and the court's approval of the warrants last week do not change that. Israel is, of course, a partner across UK priorities, including trade, investment, security, and science and technology. We do cooperate across a wide range of issues for our mutual benefit. This government remains focused, Mr. Speaker, on pushing for an immediate ceasefire to bring an end to the devastating violence in Gaza. This is essential to protect civilians, ensure the release of hostages, and to increase humanitarian aid into Gaza. We have always said diplomacy is what will see an end to this conflict, and that can only be achieved through dialogue. It is in the long-term interest of the Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider region to agree to a ceasefire deal urgently and bring this devastating conflict to an end.
Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for the State of Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and its former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant will do nothing to help secure the release of those poor hostages who've been held captive by Hamas for over a year. nor will it help to get more aid into Gaza, and it will not deliver a sustainable end to this awful conflict. And in charging Israeli leaders alongside Hamas, the ICC appears to be drawing a moral equivalence between Israel's war of self-defense and Hamas terrorism. We utterly reject any moral equivalence. The only beneficiaries of this decision are Hamas and their terrorist sponsors, Iran, who are now celebrating this propaganda coup as a great victory for Hamas and Hezbollah. Since the ICC's decision, we have had dither from ministers and confused messaging and no clarity, so I'm grateful to the minister today for his remarks. So the government has indicated already that it will seek to enforce these warrants through our own courts, and there is a process around that. And as to the issue of warrants, we have raised serious concerns over process, jurisdiction, and the position on complementarity principle, and believe the warrants of Mr Netanyahu and Gallant have no basis in international law. So does the government believe the court has jurisdiction in this case, given that Israel is not party to the Rome Statute and Palestine is not a recognised state? Does the minister agree that the ICC must act within legal norms? And in the absence of the ICC making public the specific context of the charges, does the minister share concerns expressed about reports of process errors in the ICC's investigation and the concerns that Lord MacDonald, the former DPP, has raised about the use by the prosecutor of an expert panel? And finally, but crucially, what effect does the minister believe that Mr Netanyahu's immunity under international law as a serving Prime Minister of a country which is not a state party has on enforcing these warrants in the UK's own courts? Mr Speaker, these are important questions. I look forward to the Minister responding. But it is really important that at this time when there is such a conflict taking place, the Minister has already spoken about securing the release of hostages, more aid coming into Gaza, that we have clear clarity from this government. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the questions from my right honourable friend across the benches. It is, of course, utmost in this government's mind the need to bring an immediate end to the conflict in Gaza, to secure the release of the hostages whose families I have met, and I know the right honourable friend knows that I'm familiar with these issues from my previous life. We also, of course, need to see more aid going into Gaza, and the questions at issue with the ICC are separate from that. Diplomacy will continue regardless of the process of the ICC, but I had understood it to be the common position of this House that the international rule of law is an important commitment. The International Criminal Court is the primary body in enforcing these norms, and the issues on jurisdiction and complementarity were heard by the pre-trial chamber. Its 3 judges have issued their findings, and I think we should respect those.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Criminal Court was created when 120 countries put their names to the Rome Statute and signed up to the principle that certain basic standards of behaviour must be enforced internationally, and those laws would be applicable to everyone, no matter who they were. From the time when Winston Churchill led the party opposite, this country has been a proud supporter of international law, and it is wrong for us to try to undermine it. Does my honourable friend share my deep disappointment that the Conservatives have fallen as far as they have?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I think has been clear from the actions of this government from July when we became the government, the international rule of law is incredibly important to this government, and all of our actions will be guided by it.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has had a devastating impact on Palestinian and Israeli civilians, with women and children paying a particularly terrible price. Now that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for those it believes are culpable, the UK indeed has obligations under international law that we must uphold. The previous Conservative government chose to be selective with those obligations when it came to the ICC's jurisdiction in the occupied Palestinian territories. That was deeply regrettable and damaging for our country, and I greatly regret that the Conservative front bench are pursuing the same line today. It is right that the government has committed to uphold this ruling, and I welcome the Minister's statement that it will support the process to enforce these arrest warrants. But does the Minister share my concern about the words of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who has proposed sanctioning nations, including the UK, who uphold this ruling? And can the Minister outline the specific new steps the government is taking to secure an immediate bilateral ceasefire with all parties, so we can put a stop to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, get the hostages home, and open the door to a two-state solution?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every member of this government, most particularly the Foreign Secretary and the rest of the Foreign Office ministerial team, are engaged every day, including this morning, in pressing all parties for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon, and for a de-escalation of violence, of course, in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories, but also more broadly in the Middle East, where violence remains far too high.
Andy Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of a democratic state, which is a UK ally, finding there are reasonable grounds that he is responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Doesn't that call for action as well as words from the UK government, which might include ending trade with illegal settlements, the sanctioning of members of the government and settlers, and indeed the recognition of the state of Palestine, if we are to show not only our disapproval, but how we want to move forward?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recognise the long commitment to these issues from my honourable friends. I will not comment further, as you'd expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the ICC process, which needs to now carry through in accordance with due process and in the way that you would expect. And on the issues of sanctions, which have been discussed in this chamber before, I'm not at liberty to provide any further commentary on who we might consider for sanctions in the usual way.
Oliver Dowden.
Whatever reservations one may have about the conduct of the conflict in Gaza, there are two fundamental principles. One, Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader of a sovereign state, and two, that state is conducting a legitimate war of self-defence. Now, the Minister acknowledges those facts, but does he not appreciate how this ruling is seen as an affront to those principles by many of my constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm slightly stumped by the questions opposite. We're signatories to the ICC Act. I think the whole House agrees with the importance of the rule of law. Representations have been made to the ICC in the pre-trial chamber, and they have found they have come to their decisions. I think we should respect their independence.
Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I find it shocking but not surprising that the Conservative Party has chosen to downgrade and disparage the highly respected International Criminal Court. We're a nation that upholds the rule of law, so I am very proud that the new Labour government has chosen to respect the independence of the ICC. With ICC arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Deif, who, on the basis that there are reasonable grounds that they bear criminal responsibility for potential war crimes, does the Minister agree that it is important that we respect the independence of that ICC judgment and that, if required, we implement the said finding?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not really able to go much further than to say that there is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that would determine whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant. We would follow the due process in the way that you would expect, and this is a decision not for government ministers but for an independent court.
David Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister may be aware I've fought the corner for international courts time and time again in this House, and I view upholding the authority of those courts and the reputation of those courts as very important. The difficulty here is not just that Israel is a democracy, but it has an internal independent judiciary, which puts a limit on what any government can do in Israel, which is why equating or appearing to equate Netanyahu with all the other monsters that the International Criminal Court has quite properly prosecuted risks bringing the court into disrepute.
Where's the limit?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Right Honourable Member has looked at these issues over a long period of time. Questions of complementarity are, of course, important, and I understand they were considered by the pre-trial chamber.
Florence Eshamole. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Several of our allies and international partners have outlined their commitment fully supporting the ICC, including Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium and Ireland. So I welcome the government's commitment in respecting the independence of the ICC. Does the Minister agree that the ICC has a very high evidential threshold when it comes to the issuing of arrest warrants for alleged perpetrators? And has this now not been demonstrated with this case?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The deliberations of the ICC on this matter have gone on for some time, and I think it's been clear for all to see the way in which they proceeded, and I welcome them.
Leila Moran.
Last week I attended a memorial service for the people of Gaza with families of Palestinian origin here in the UK. I believe the ministers met with some of those representatives already. And we heard from a woman called Kitam, who described how overnight she lost 48 members of her family. And she, as she walked back, sat behind me and broke down in sobs as she remembered so painfully that day. She deserves justice. This issuing of a warrant is not justice. There is still a process to go through, there is still a trial to be had. But is it not right that whatever the court, those outcomes are adhered to? So might I press him on the ruling of the ICJ advisory opinion on the occupation? Because at the core of this is that ruling. And that should mean that we are doing much more than just meeting with those families and sharing in their pain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Honourable Member alludes, I've met with these families as well, and many other families who have been so wounded by the conduct of this conflict over the course of the last year on both sides, both the hostage families and the many Palestinians and Lebanese who've seen their lives so cruelly turned upside down. As I said earlier, in the end, it is only diplomacy that will bring an end to this conflict. We will continue to have contact with all sides, including those indicted. We will continue to press all those with whom we engage to bring an early end to this war. In relation to the ICJ, we've set out our position before. We are considering the judgment carefully. We've provided an explanation of our position so far in the United Nations. It is an important, far-reaching judgment, and we hope to be able to say more in due course.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's confirmation that the UK will be upholding the ICC arrest warrants for the Hamas general and Israeli leaders. The ICC found grounds to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant each bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution and other humane acts. It goes on to say the crime of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. On that last point, what moral justification is there now for continuing arms sales used by Israeli forces at the behest of a Prime Minister accused of such serious war crimes? When will we use every diplomatic lever to stop the killing, free all hostages and stop selling arms to a country led by someone accused of such horrific war crimes?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to just be clear that what I've said this afternoon is not that the government will uphold arrest warrants. What I have been clear about this afternoon is that due process will be followed. These are questions for independent courts in the UK, and it is independent courts that would review the arrest warrants if that situation were to arise. My honourable friend asks about aid. I want to be absolutely clear, insufficient aid is getting into Gaza. I travelled myself to the Gaza border and saw the restrictions Israel is putting on aid reaching Gaza. Those restrictions have been called out by me and other members of the Foreign Office day in, day out. We are taking steps with our partners and our allies to try and ensure that those in Gaza have the aid that they need as winter comes in in order to survive. These are grave matters, and I understand the frustration of right across this House that we have not seen the amount of aid in Gaza that we would like to see. And I recognise that people are asking for yet more to be done. We, of course, in relation to the specific question about the arms licence suspensions that were announced to this House on the 2nd of September, we will, of course, keep that under review, and we will consider the findings of the ICC in relation to that assessment.
Stephen Flynn.
Speaker, last year the Labour Party had to be dragged into accepting that there was a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Indeed, the honourable gentleman's boss said that war is ugly. The Labour Party earlier this year had to be dragged into even uttering the words ceasefire. So can I ask him, will he show the leadership that his bosses failed to do and say that if Benjamin Netanyahu's feet touch the ground in the UK, you will comply with the arrest warrant?
Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I wasn't quite quick enough on my feet. The honourable member says with dismay, war is ugly. War is ugly. And we are doing everything that we can to bring it to a close through all of the diplomatic measures that you would expect. This is not an issue for grandstanding. This is an issue for diplomacy. And that is what this government is committed to.
Apsana Begum.
Surely central to the debate today must be the UK's ongoing political role as Israel's close ally and the fact that UK-made weapons, including components, are still being used by Israel. Does the Minister recognise that beyond the commitment to uphold the ICC's arrest warrants, the UK's failure to clearly condemn the collective punishment of civilians, an intent explicitly indicated by key Israeli leading figures, and the continued military support for Israel's ongoing onslaught in Gaza have serious implications for the UK's own human rights obligations and the fate of millions of innocent men, women and children?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the my honourable friend for her question. I won't rehearse too much the answers provided on the 2nd of September and on numerous occasions in this chamber since then. We have suspended, with one exemption, which I'm happy to turn to again, all of the arms that we are selling to Israel that could be used in Gaza. That suspension, in our assessment, also covers the West Bank and Lebanon. We are taking action in accordance with our commitments under international humanitarian law, and we will continue to do so.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Deputy Speaker, can we be absolutely clear about what the government is saying? Because it seems the government is not saying there would be an automatic arrest should Benjamin Netanyahu arrive in this country, that there would be due process. And could he confirm that customarily international law does not permit the arrest or the delivering of the Prime Minister of a non-state party to the ICC? So he's committing to due process, but he's not committing to arrest. Am I correct in understanding that?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's a domestic legal process through our independent courts. We cannot prejudge that process. I note that the Shadow Attorney General has written to the Attorney General on questions of detail in relation to some of the points you allude to, and the Attorney General tells me he will be writing back on those more detailed points.
Nasha.
Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst we work tirelessly to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which is really important, simply because the children don't see an end in sight, neither do the families in Gaza. Does the Minister also agree with me that Britain's reputation on the world scene as a global leader for upholding justice would be undermined if Britain did not respect the independence of the ICC, as those on the Conservative benches are implying?
Madam Deputy Speaker, this government thinks that adherence to international law and being seen to adhere to international law is incredibly important, and in everything we've done since July, we have sought to underline that principle, and I would hope that it would be one that the whole House would support us in.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has assured us that the arrest warrants will be carried out, and I hope that is the case. Could he also consider that if an arrest warrant has been issued for the leader of a country, if the International Court of Justice has found it deeply wanting on its behaviour and as an occupying power and the war crimes that have been committed, why are we still supplying weapons that are taking part in the bombardment of Gaza that are destroying life as we speak?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I said in answer to a question from my own benches, we took steps on the 2nd of September to ensure that, with one exemption, which I'm happy to go into, that we are not selling arms which are being used, which could pose a breach of international humanitarian law in Gaza, and that continues to be the position, and it is kept under regular review.
Abtisam Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC's decision is a crucial step to ensuring justice and accountability for the crimes against humanity committed in Gaza and Israel. It is vital that the government acts without fear or favour in order to uphold the international rules-based system. War crimes are wrong, whoever commits them and wherever they happen, whether by Russian forces in unlawfully occupied Ukraine or by Israeli forces in unlawfully occupied Palestinian territory. Will the Minister now review all diplomatic, economic and political relations with Israel to ensure our country is not complicit with the atrocities taking place in Gaza, the West Bank and in Lebanon?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can confirm that the Department keeps its and the Government as a whole keeps its international obligations under close review, including in relation to the theatres described.
Monica Harding. Madam Deputy Speaker, last week I was in the West Bank and saw for myself the incursions by settlers into the occupied Palestinian territories, following recent comments from Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, describing in explicit terms the active effort to annex the West Bank to Israel. Does the Minister agree that now is the time to sanction Smotrich?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the comments of Finance Minister Smotrich have been condemned in this chamber before, and we can reiterate those condemnations. But as my friend would expect, we cannot put comment on sanctions which may or may not be under consideration in the usual way.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm no friend of Hamas, but we must remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu promised us intelligence-led precision attacks in Gaza. What we've seen is daily violation of international law, 43,000 people killed, restrictions on food aid, 136 journalists killed. So I welcome the government and its announcement to respect the ICC's decision. But can I urge us also to consider all levers, including sanctions against two of the Israeli government ministers, and also sanctions against the settlers in the West Bank and other organisations operating therein.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not comment on what sanctions may be under review for reasons which are well established, but I would draw my honourable friend's attention to the sanctions that we have already taken in October against Israeli settlers and organisations involved in both breaches of international law and violence in the West Bank.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our closest ally is the United States of America, and there has been widespread condemnation of these arrest warrants being issued across both the House of Representatives and Congress. What effect does the Minister think this decision will have on our relationship with the United States of America, particularly with the new incoming administration, which has very different views?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK is a state party to the Rome Statute, and this brings with it obligations that put us in a different position from the US. We will, of course, continue to engage both with the current and the incoming US administration in the shared interests of our two countries across the full range of our priorities.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The atrocities that led to the issuing of the arrest warrants continue to this day, not least in healthcare facilities where we see the devastating stories coming out of Gaza. However, my honourable friend has set out his frustration at aid not reaching those very facilities, and yet there is more sanction that could be applied by this government. So why will he not escalate now the UK's response to the Israeli government by placing those sanctions so they really feel the real pain of our country, but also understand that we want to ensure that justice is served by the ICC?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to reassure the House how focused the government is on the question of aid access into Gaza. As I say, I've travelled to the region and I've raised these issues repeatedly with all parties, including the Israeli government. We need to see a flood of aid into Israel. That is what has been the commitment of the Israeli government, and I regret that we have not yet seen that flood of aid and that Palestinians are suffering as a consequence. Winter is coming, and Palestinians in Gaza are extremely vulnerable, and we will continue to press the Israeli government to do everything that it can to ensure that more aid reaches Gaza and indeed into all parts of the occupied Palestinian territories that require it. I made these points forcefully this morning, and I will continue to make them.
Liz Saville-Roberts. The ICC has issued arrest warrants for crimes including direct attacks on civilians. Open source information shows that the RAF reconnaissance flights are going over Gaza and average nearly 4 flights a day. While, of course, we all seek the information necessary to gain the release of the hostages, how confident is he that the information used and shared with Israel from these flights has not been used to facilitate any attacks on civilians?
Good question. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not go into operational details, but I can assure the House these surveillance aircraft are unarmed, do not have a combat role, and are tasked solely to locate hostages, including a British national, and they will continue to do so.